The metal feed bucket still sat where Chloe Sander had left it that September morning in 1987, untouched by the horses that should have emptied it hours ago. Robert Sander stared at the galvanized container, his calloused hands trembling as the September sun climbed higher over his 300-acre farm in Millbrook County, Nebraska. Something was impossibly wrong with this picture. Chloe never left the horses unfed. Not once in 19 years had his daughter broken her morning routine. The contradiction hit him like a physical blow. Chloe's red flannel jacket hung on its usual peg in the barn, but she was nowhere to be found. Her favorite mare, Buttercup, stood at the fence line whinnying with an urgency that made Robert's stomach clench. The other horses paced restlessly in their stalls, their usual morning calm replaced by an agitation that seemed to mirror his own growing panic. The feed bucket mocked him with its fullness, each grain of oats a testament to a routine that had been violently interrupted. 36 years later, on a humid August afternoon, that same sense of wrongness would wash over park ranger Lisa Hilton as she examined a tarnished silver locket wedged deep inside the hollow of an ancient oak tree in Morrison Woods. The delicate piece of jewelry, engraved with the initials SM, had been hidden in nature's vault for decades, waiting to resurrect questions that had haunted a small farming community for over 3 decades. But on this morning in 1987, Robert Sander knew nothing of hollow trees or silver lockets. He only knew that his daughter had vanished between the house and the barn, a distance of barely 50 yards. The morning had started like every other. Chloe's alarm clock had buzzed at 5:30, just as it had every day since she'd taken over the morning feeding duties at age 12. Robert's wife, Margaret, had heard their daughter's footsteps on the creaking farmhouse stairs, the familiar sound of boots being pulled on by the back door, the gentle slam of the screen door that never quite closed properly. These were the sounds of normalcy, the rhythm of rural life that had played out unchanged for years. By 7 o'clock, when Chloe hadn't returned for breakfast, Margaret had sent Robert to check on her. That's when he found the feed bucket, full and accusing. That's when he discovered that the gate to the back pasture, always kept securely latched, stood wide open. That's when he noticed the tire tracks in the soft earth near the old logging road, tracks that didn't match any vehicle he recognized from their isolated farming community. If you're drawn to mysteries that have haunted small communities for decades, stories where every detail matters and every silence speaks volumes, make sure to subscribe and join us as we uncover the truth behind cases that time forgot. Because sometimes the answers we seek are hidden in the most unexpected places. The Sander family had worked the same Nebraska soil for 3 generations, their roots running as deep as the cottonwoods that lined Willow Creek at the eastern edge of their property. Robert's grandfather had homesteaded the land in 1923, building the white-clappered farmhouse with his own hands, raising cattle and corn, with the quiet determination that defined men of his generation. By 1987, the farm had become a picture of rural prosperity. 300 acres of prime agricultural land, a modern dairy operation, and a family name that carried weight in Millbrook County. Chloe Elizabeth Sander embodied everything her community valued in a young woman. At 19, she possessed the kind of wholesome beauty that photographers tried to capture for grain elevator calendars. Sun-streaked blonde hair, bright blue eyes, and a smile that could charm even the crustiest old farmers at the weekly livestock auction. But Chloe was more than just a pretty face in a farming community that sometimes struggled to keep its young people from fleeing to the cities. She had earned a full scholarship to study veterinary medicine at the University of Nebraska, an achievement that made her parents beam with pride every time someone mentioned it at church or the grain elevator. Unlike many of her classmates who couldn't wait to escape the perceived limitations of rural life, Chloe genuinely loved the rhythm of farm existence. She had postponed starting college for a year to help her father modernize their dairy operation, learning to read financial statements and market reports with the same attention to detail she applied to caring for sick calves. Every morning before dawn, she would pull on her worn leather boots and make her way to the barn, moving through the familiar routine of feeding and watering with an efficiency born of years of practice. The community of Millbrook itself consisted of barely 800 souls, the kind of place where 3 generations might sit in the same church pew every Sunday, where the high school graduating class rarely exceeded 30 students, and where everyone knew not just your name but your family history going back to the homesteading days. The town's main street featured the essentials of rural life, Jenkins's General Store, where you could buy everything from fishing tackle to prescription medications, the First National Bank of Millbrook in a building that hadn't changed its facade since 1934, and Rosie's Cafe, where the same group of retired farmers gathered every morning at 6 to solve the world's problems over coffee and homemade pie. In this insular world, the Sanders occupied a position of quiet respect. Robert served on the school board and the County Agricultural Extension Committee. Margaret sang in the church choir and organized the annual Harvest Festival that brought families from 3 counties to Millbrook's tiny downtown. Chloe helped with the church youth group and had been voted Dairy Princess at the county fair 3 years running, a title that involved more knowledge of bovine genetics than most people realized. The family's daily routine had remained unchanged for years. Margaret would rise at 5 to start breakfast, while Robert headed out to begin the morning milking. Chloe's job was to feed the horses and check on the cattle in the back pasture before returning to help her mother prepare for the day ahead. It was a system that worked, a testament to the kind of structured rural life that had sustained farming families for generations. On September 15, 1987, that carefully ordered world would shatter like glass, leaving fragments that would cut deep for decades to come. By 8:30 that September morning, Margaret Sanders' calls to Chloe had grown increasingly frantic, her voice echoing across the farmyard with a desperation that made the livestock nervous. When Robert returned from the barn empty-handed, his face pale beneath his weathered tan, Margaret knew with a mother's instinct that something terrible had happened. The coffee she had been keeping warm for Chloe sat untouched on the kitchen counter, growing cold as the minutes stretched into an eternity of not knowing. Robert's first call went to Sheriff Tom Bradley, a man who had known the Sander family since childhood and had attended Chloe's high school graduation just 14 months earlier. Bradley arrived within 20 minutes, his patrol car kicking up dust as it turned into the familiar gravel driveway. At 53, Bradley had served as sheriff for nearly 2 decades, but his experience consisted mainly of drunk and disorderly arrests, the occasional domestic dispute, and livestock theft cases. Missing persons, especially someone like Chloe Sander, fell far outside his usual wheelhouse. The initial search focused on the immediate area around the farm, with Bradley methodically walking the route from the house to the barn, photographing the mysterious tire tracks near the logging road with his department's single Polaroid camera. The tracks appeared fresh, pressed deep into the soft earth that had been dampened by the previous evening's light rain. They belonged to a vehicle with wider tires than most of the pickup trucks and farm equipment common to the area, suggesting something larger, possibly a van or truck from outside the immediate community. Within hours, word of Chloe's disappearance had spread through Millbrook's tight-knit network with the speed that only small towns could achieve. The volunteer fire department, led by Chief Harold Brennan, organized the first systematic search party. By noon, more than 60 people had gathered at the Sander farm, including farmers who had left their own harvest preparations, shop owners who had closed their businesses, and even the entire senior class from Millbrook High School. They formed search lines and began walking the vast expanse of the Sander property, calling Chloe's name until their voices grew hoarse. The searches continued as the sun reached its peak and began its descent toward the western horizon. Volunteers combed through the cornfields, where the stalk stood 8 feet tall, creating a maze of potential hiding places. Others focused on the dense woodland that bordered the farm's eastern edge, pushing through underbrush that hadn't been disturbed by human feet in years. The local chapter of the Civil Air Patrol launched their small aircraft to conduct aerial searches, the drone of the engines adding an ominous soundtrack to the ground efforts below. As darkness approached, the initial optimism began to fade. Chloe's horse Buttercup remained agitated, refusing food and pacing restlessly in her stall despite Margaret's attempts to calm her. The other horses seemed to sense the mare's distress, creating an atmosphere of unease that permeated the entire barnyard. Dogs brought in by some of the volunteers showed interest in the area near the logging road, but couldn't establish a clear scent trail, suggesting that Chloe might have been transported away from the farm by vehicle. The second day of searching brought revelations that deepened the mystery rather than solving it. Deputy Jim Hartwell, one of Bradley's 2 full-time officers, discovered that the gate leading to the back pasture hadn't simply been left open. The heavy metal latch showed scratches consistent with having been forced by someone unfamiliar with its mechanism. Local farmers knew that the stubborn latch required a specific upward lift while simultaneously pushing the gatepost, but the scratches suggested someone had struggled with it, possibly in darkness or under stress. More disturbing was the behavior of Chloe's horse Buck, a normally gentle gelding that had been her companion for nearly 8 years. The horse displayed an agitation that veteran horsemen in the search party had rarely seen, refusing to allow anyone except Robert to approach his stall. When forced to move, Buck would shy away from the area near the logging road, his ears pinned back and nostrils flared, as if detecting some lingering threat that humans couldn't perceive. Margaret later told investigators that she had never seen the horse behave this way, not even during severe thunderstorms that typically terrified him. The tire tracks near the logging road became the focus of intense scrutiny. Deputy Hartwell made plaster casts using supplies borrowed from the high school's art department, our technique he had learned from a forensics manual but had never actually employed in the field. The impressions revealed a distinctive tread pattern that didn't match any of the vehicles belonging to the Sander family or their immediate neighbors. The depth of the impressions suggested a heavy vehicle, possibly loaded with equipment or cargo, that had sat in that location for an extended period rather than simply passing through. Local mechanic and volunteer firefighter Pete Donovan examined the casts and identified the tires as commercial grade, the type typically found on work trucks or vans rather than personal vehicles. The tread pattern wasn't familiar to him, despite 30 years of working on every type of vehicle in the county, suggesting that the vehicle had come from outside the immediate area. This detail sent a chill through the tight-knit community. The idea that someone from outside their protective bubble had invaded their sanctuary. Perhaps most unsettling was the discovery of Chloe's leather gloves.
If you're like me and don't rest until solving a crime, click and subscribe to the channel.
Gloves found by volunteer searcher Emma Kowalski nearly a quarter-mile from the main farm buildings. The gloves lay beside a fallen log in a wooded area that Chloe rarely visited, placed almost too neatly to have been dropped accidentally. They showed no signs of damage or struggle, but their location made no sense in the context of Chloe's normal morning routine. The gloves had been a Christmas gift from her grandmother, distinctive hand-tooled leather with her initials embossed on the cuffs, impossible to mistake for anyone else's. Sheriff Bradley sent the gloves to the state crime lab in Lincoln, but the results would take weeks to process. The limited forensic resources available to rural law enforcement in 1987 meant that evidence analysis moved at a glacial pace, and Bradley found himself making decisions based more on instinct than scientific certainty. The growing pile of unexplained details, the forced gate latch, the mysterious tire tracks, the disturbed horses, the carefully placed gloves, created a picture that suggested something far more sinister than a simple case of a young woman wandering off and getting lost. As the search entered its 3rd day, the initial energy of the volunteer efforts began to wane, replaced by a grim determination tinged with growing dread. The questions multiplied faster than the answers, and each new piece of evidence seemed to deepen rather than resolve the central mystery of what had happened to Chloe Sander in those crucial minutes between leaving the house and failing to reach the barn. 3 weeks into the investigation, Sheriff Tom Bradley sat in his cramped office staring at a case file that seemed to mock him with its thinness. The fluorescent light overhead flickered intermittently, casting shadows across the few photographs and reports that constituted the entire official record of Chloe Sander's disappearance. For a man who had built his reputation on knowing everyone and everything that happened in Millbrook County, the complete absence of answers felt like a personal failure that gnawed at him during sleepless nights. The state investigators had arrived on the 4th day with promises of modern techniques and fresh perspectives, but their enthusiasm had quickly dampened when confronted with the reality of rural law enforcement resources. Detective Ray Morrison from the Nebraska State Patrol, spent 2 days examining the evidence before delivering his preliminary assessment with the kind of clinical detachment that made Bradley's jaw clench. Without surveillance cameras, reliable witnesses, or substantial physical evidence beyond the tire tracks and gloves, Morrison explained, the case would likely be classified as a voluntary missing person situation unless more compelling evidence emerged. The forensics report on Chloe's gloves had returned inconclusive, revealing only her own fingerprints and traces of the leather conditioner she used to maintain them. The soil samples from the mysterious tire tracks showed nothing unusual, and despite Pete Donovan's certainty about the commercial-grade tires, attempts to trace the tread pattern through regional dealerships had yielded no meaningful leads. The state crime lab, already backlogged with cases from larger cities, treated the rural disappearance as a low priority, their reports arriving weeks late and offering little more than confirmation of what local investigators already knew. Bradley found himself caught between the Sander family's desperate need for answers and the harsh reality of small-town policing in 1987. His department's annual budget barely covered basic operations, let alone extended investigations that might require travel, specialized equipment, or expert consultants. The two-way radio system that connected his office to the patrol cars had been installed in 1974 and regularly failed during rainstorms. His evidence locker consisted of a single filing cabinet with a padlock that any determined teenager could have picked. More frustrating than the resource limitations were the growing number of theories and false leads that consumed precious time and manpower. Well-meaning residents called the sheriff's office daily, with reported sightings of Chloe in neighboring counties, each requiring investigation despite their improbability. Emma Kowalski, the volunteer who had found Chloe's gloves, became convinced that she had psychic insights into the case and appeared at the sheriff's office every few days with new visions and interpretations of dreams that she insisted held crucial clues. The community's initial unity began to fracture as weeks passed without progress. Whispered conversations in Rosie's Cafe and Jenkins' General Store gave birth to darker theories about what might have happened to Chloe. Some residents began to view their neighbors with suspicion, wondering if the answer to the mystery lay closer to home than anyone wanted to admit. The Kowalski family, recent immigrants from Poland who had purchased a struggling farm on the outskirts of town, found themselves the subject of unfounded speculation simply because they were outsiders who kept to themselves. Robert Sander's transformation from grieving father to amateur detective began gradually, so incrementally that Margaret didn't recognize the full extent of his obsession until it had consumed him entirely. 2 months after Chloe's disappearance, he converted the small room above their garage into what he called his research center, filling it with maps, photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes that covered every surface like the desperate scribblings of a man losing his grip on reality. The room became Robert's sanctuary and prison simultaneously. He would spend entire nights up there, drinking black coffee from a thermos and chain-smoking Marlboro cigarettes despite having quit the habit 15 years earlier when Chloe had begged him to stop. The walls were covered with a detailed topographical map of Millbrook County, marked with colored pins indicating search areas, witness locations, and his own theories about potential routes Chloe's abductor might have taken. Red string connected various pins in patterns that made perfect sense to Robert, but appeared chaotic to anyone else who dared to enter his private world of investigation. Margaret would find him asleep at his makeshift desk most mornings, his head resting on stacks of police reports he had somehow convinced Sheriff Bradley to copy for him. The official investigation might have stalled, but Robert's private inquiry consumed every waking moment, and most of his sleeping ones as well. He had purchased a used camera and taught himself basic photography, documenting every inch of their property and the surrounding areas with the methodical precision of a professional crime scene investigator. His collection of evidence grew to include items that any rational person would have discarded as meaningless. Fragments of fabric caught on barbed wire fences, unusual tire impressions found miles from their farm, even cigarette butts discovered near the logging road that he carefully preserved in labeled plastic bags. Robert had read every forensics manual he could find in the county library, studying fingerprint classification, soil analysis, and behavioral profiling, with the dedication of a graduate student pursuing an advanced degree in criminology. The obsession began to strain his marriage as Margaret watched her husband disappear into a world where their daughter's abduction was the only reality that mattered. Their conversations, once filled with discussions of farm operations and community gossip, now revolved exclusively around Robert's latest theories and discoveries. He would corner friends and neighbors at church or in town, pressing them for details about strangers they might have seen, or unusual activities they might have witnessed, his intensity making people uncomfortable and eventually driving them to avoid him altogether. Margaret's own grief had followed a different path, one that involved accepting the possibility that they might never know what happened to Chloe, while still maintaining hope that she might somehow return. She continued to cook Chloe's favorite meals on Sundays, maintained her daughter's room exactly as she had left it, and found comfort in the routines and rituals that had once brought their family together. But Robert's approach to grief involved action, investigation, and an absolute refusal to accept uncertainty, creating a fundamental incompatibility in how they processed their loss. The financial cost of Robert's private investigation began to mount as he purchased equipment, traveled to follow up on leads, and hired a private investigator from Omaha who took his money while producing no results. Farm operations suffered as Robert devoted more time to his research than to the cattle and crops that provided their livelihood. Margaret found herself making excuses to neighbors and creditors, explaining Robert's distraction while privately wondering if her husband would ever find his way back to the life they had built together, before that September morning changed everything forever. The ancient oak tree in Morrison Woods had stood sentinel over the Nebraska landscape for more than 2 centuries, its massive trunk scarred by lightning strikes and decades of harsh prairie weather. On August 15, 2023, Park Ranger Lisa Hilton was conducting her routine trail maintenance when she noticed something glinting inside the tree's hollow, a cavity that had been carved out by time and the elements until it formed a natural vault nearly 3 feet deep. The summer heat had been particularly brutal that week, with temperatures reaching the mid-90s and humidity levels that made even the hardiest Midwesterners seek shade. Lisa had been working since dawn, clearing fallen branches and updating trail markers along the nature preserve that had been established in Morrison Woods during the 1990s. The hollow oak sat approximately 2 miles from the nearest parking area, accessible only by a narrow hiking trail that most casual visitors never bothered to explore. As Lisa reached into the cavity to remove what she initially assumed was litter left by careless hikers, her fingers closed around something small and metallic. The object came free easily, as if it had been waiting decades for someone to discover it. In her palm lay a tarnished silver locket, heart-shaped and delicate, with intricate engravings that had somehow survived the ravages of time despite being exposed to moisture, temperature fluctuations, and the occasional curious woodland creature. The locket bore the unmistakable initials SM, engraved in flowing script across its front surface. More intriguingly, when Lisa carefully opened the tiny clasp, she found that the interior still contained 2 small photographs, their edges brown with age, but their images still recognizable. One showed a young blonde woman with bright eyes and a genuine smile, while the other depicted the same girl with an older couple who appeared to be her parents. All 3 posed in front of a white farmhouse that looked distinctly rural and Midwestern. Lisa's training as a park ranger had included basic procedures for handling potential evidence, and something about the locket's location and condition immediately struck her as significant. The hollow tree was positioned in a remote section of the woods that would have been nearly impossible to access accidentally. Someone had deliberately placed the locket in that natural hiding spot, and the level of tarnishing suggested it had been there for many years, possibly decades. The discovery took on even greater significance when Lisa consulted the historical records maintained by the county sheriff's department. Morrison Woods had been the site of extensive searches in 1987 following the disappearance of 19-year-old Chloe Sander from her family's farm approximately 5 miles to the west. The woods had been combed by volunteers and law enforcement officers for weeks, but the hollow oak's remote location and the dense underbrush that had grown up around it over the years meant that the natural vault had remained undisturbed and unsearched. Lisa immediately contacted the current sheriff, David Reynolds, who had been a young deputy when Chloe Sander first disappeared. Reynolds arrived within an hour, his weathered face grave as he examined the locket and compared its initials to the old case files that had been digitized and stored in the department's computer system. The photographs inside the locket matched school pictures of Chloe Sander from her senior year at Millbrook High School, and the farmhouse in the family photo was clearly identifiable as the Sander property. Chapter 8. Reopening Old Wounds. The call came to Margaret Sander at 11:30 on a Tuesday morning while she was tending to her garden, the same vegetable plot where she had taught Chloe to distinguish between weeds and seedlings 36 years earlier. At 78, Margaret's hands had developed the tremor that comes with age, but her voice remained steady as Sheriff Reynolds explained the discovery in Morrison Woods. The locket had been Chloe's 16th birthday gift from her grandmother, a piece that Chloe had worn every day until her disappearance, never removing it even for swimming or sports activities. Margaret's first reaction was not relief or renewed hope, but rather a bone-deep exhaustion that seemed to settle over her like a heavy blanket. The decades had taught her to live with uncertainty, to function despite the permanent ache of not knowing, and the sudden resurrection of active investigation felt more like a burden than a blessing. Robert had died 3 years earlier, his obsession with finding answers having consumed the last 2 decades of his life, until his heart finally surrendered to the constant stress of unanswered questions. Detective Amanda Foster from the Nebraska State Patrol's Cold Case Unit took over the reinvestigation with the kind of methodical approach that had been impossible in 1987. Foster brought with her the advantages of modern forensic science, DNA analysis, digital enhancement of old photographs, and computer databases that could cross-reference information across multiple jurisdictions. The locket itself was sent to the State Crime Lab for comprehensive analysis, including attempts to extract DNA from the chain and interior surfaces that might belong to someone other than Chloe. The reinvestigation began with a systematic review of all original evidence, much of which had been stored in conditions that were less than ideal for preservation. Sheriff Bradley's old case files, now yellow with age and stored in cardboard boxes in the courthouse basement, were carefully photographed and digitized. The tire track impressions, stored in Robert Sander's Garage Research Center since his death, were re-examined using new techniques that could potentially identify specific vehicle makes and models, with greater precision than had been possible decades earlier. Foster's team conducted fresh interviews with surviving witnesses, many of whom were now elderly and struggling with memories clouded by time and repeated retellings. Emma Kowalski, now in her 80s and living in an assisted care facility, still claimed to have psychic insights into the case, but her recollections of finding Chloe's gloves had become embellished with details that clearly contradicted the original police reports. Pete Donovan, the mechanic who had analyzed the original tire impressions, had died 5 years earlier, taking with him any additional insights he might have had about the mysterious vehicle. Perhaps most significantly, Foster's investigation uncovered evidence that had been overlooked or inadequately investigated in 1987. A review of regional missing persons cases from the same time period revealed 3 other young women who had disappeared under similar circumstances within a 200-mile radius of Millbrook County. All 3 cases involved women in their late teens or early 20s who had vanished while engaged in routine activities, with minimal physical evidence left behind, and investigations that had quickly stalled due to limited resources. The pattern that emerged suggested the possibility of a serial predator who had operated in rural areas where law enforcement resources were stretched thin and interjurisdictional communication was limited. In 1987, the various county sheriff's departments had little means of sharing information effectively, and cases that might have revealed connections when viewed together had been investigated in isolation. Foster's computerized analysis of the timing, geography, and methodology of the disappearances painted a disturbing picture of what might have been a coordinated series of abductions that had gone undetected for decades. The revelation that Chloe's case might be connected to other unsolved disappearances brought both hope and horror to the surviving family members and community residents who had lived with the mystery for so long. The The possibility of finally getting answers was tempered by the realization that Chloe had likely encountered something far more sinister than a random crime of opportunity, and that her disappearance might represent just one victim in a larger pattern of predatory behavior that had continued unchecked for years. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: the digitized enhancement of photographs that Robert Sander had taken during his obsessive documentation of the crime scene area in the months following Chloe's disappearance. Detective Foster's team used modern image analysis software to examine dozens of pictures that Robert had shot with his used camera, looking for details that might have been missed by the naked eye nearly 4 decades earlier. In one photograph taken near the logging road, the enhancement revealed a partial license plate number barely visible through the underbrush where a vehicle had been partially concealed. The enhanced image showed what appeared to be the rear corner of a dark-colored van or truck, with enough of the Nebraska license plate visible to make out 3 digits and 1 letter. Foster's team ran the partial plate through the state's archived vehicle registration database, cross-referencing it with the time frame of Chloe's disappearance and the geographic area around Millbrook County. The search yielded 17 possible matches, but only one belonged to someone who had been in the area during September 1987, a maintenance van registered to Dale Carpenter, who had been working as a contractor for the county road department at the time. Carpenter's name appeared in the original case files, but only as a brief notation that he had been questioned and cleared after someone reported seeing a county vehicle in the area around the time of Chloe's disappearance. Sheriff Bradley's cursory interview with Carpenter had lasted less than 20 minutes, focusing mainly on whether he had seen anything unusual while working on road repairs near the Sander farm. Carpenter had claimed to be working several miles away that morning.
If you're a fan of mystery cases, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel.
And had provided what appeared to be credible documentation of his work schedule. The reinvestigation revealed troubling gaps in Carpenter's alibi that had not been thoroughly explored in 1987. His work logs showed that he had been assigned to repair guardrails along County Road 47, which ran directly past the Sander property, but the specific timing of his work had never been verified independently. More disturbing was the discovery that Carpenter had a history of minor infractions involving inappropriate behavior toward young women, incidents that had been handled internally by the county road department rather than being reported to law enforcement. Foster's team located Carpenter, now 71 years old and living in a mobile home park outside Grand Island, Nebraska. The intervening decades had not been kind to him. Multiple arrests for public intoxication, a conviction for attempted burglary in 1994, and a restraining order filed by a former girlfriend who had accused him of stalking behavior. When approached for an interview, Carpenter initially seemed cooperative, even eager to discuss the old case, but his demeanor changed dramatically when Foster mentioned the enhanced photograph and the partial license plate. The interview, conducted in the sterile environment of the Grand Island Police Department, revealed a man whose memory of events from 1987 was remarkably detailed for someone who claimed to have had no significant involvement in the case. Carpenter could describe the weather conditions that morning, the specific tools he had been using for guardrail repair, and even the radio station he had been listening to while working. Such precise recollection of seemingly mundane details struck Foster as unusual for someone recounting events from nearly 4 decades earlier. More significantly, Carpenter's description of his work location kept shifting during the interview. Initially, he maintained that he had been working several miles from the Sander farm, but when pressed for specifics, he admitted that his assigned section of County Road 47 would have put him within sight of the farm's access road. His explanation for why he hadn't mentioned this proximity during the original investigation, that Sheriff Bradley hadn't asked for that level of detail, seemed increasingly inadequate as the interview progressed. The DNA evidence that finally broke the case came from an unexpected source that demonstrated how thoroughly Carpenter had inserted himself into the investigation from the very beginning. Among the items in Robert Sander's obsessive collection of potential evidence were several cigarette butts that Carpenter had allegedly found near the logging road during the initial search efforts. He had presented them to Sheriff Bradley as possible clues, suggesting they might have been left by Chloe's abductor, when in reality they contained his own DNA and had been planted to misdirect the investigation. Detective Foster's team extracted DNA from the cigarette butts that had been carefully preserved in Robert's evidence collection for 36 years. When the results came back, they showed a match to DNA samples taken from Carpenter during his 1994 burglary arrest. More damning was the discovery of Chloe's DNA on the locket, found in the hollow tree, along with traces of DNA that matched Carpenter's profile. The forensic evidence painted a clear picture of Carpenter's involvement, but it also revealed the calculated nature of his crime and his attempts to manipulate the investigation. Faced with the overwhelming scientific evidence, Carpenter's facade of cooperation crumbled during a second interview. Foster had learned from studying successful interrogations of serial offenders that patience and strategic revelation of evidence often produced better results than aggressive confrontation. She methodically presented each piece of evidence: the enhanced photograph, the DNA matches, the inconsistencies in his alibi, allowing Carpenter to construct increasingly elaborate explanations until he finally trapped himself in a web of contradictions. The confession, when it finally came, was delivered in the flat, emotionless tone of someone who had carried the secret for so long that its revelation felt more like relief than admission of guilt. Carpenter described how he had been watching Chloe during his legitimate work on County Road 47, learning her routine and waiting for an opportunity. On the morning of September 15th, he had parked his van in the concealed location near the logging road and approached Chloe as she made her way to the barn, claiming that he needed to ask her about access to county property for road maintenance. Chloe had been helpful and trusting, exactly the kind of response that Carpenter had counted on from someone raised in a community where helping neighbors was considered a moral obligation. He had lured her toward his van under the pretense of showing her a map of the roadwork area, then forced her inside when she realized something was wrong. The struggle had been brief. Chloe was strong and athletic, but Carpenter was larger and had the advantage of surprise. The details of what followed were delivered with the same clinical detachment, as if Carpenter was describing routine maintenance procedures rather than the torture and murder of a 19-year-old woman. He had driven Chloe to an abandoned farmstead approximately 40 miles from Millbrook County, a property he knew was rarely visited and where he could take his time without fear of interruption. Chloe had remained conscious and defiant almost to the end, refusing to beg or plead despite the horror of her situation. Carpenter had kept Chloe's locket as a trophy, but as the investigation intensified and search parties came closer to the abandoned farmstead, he had decided to dispose of it in a location that would never be searched. The hollow tree in Morrison Woods had seemed like the perfect hiding place, remote enough to avoid discovery, but close enough to the original crime scene to satisfy his need to keep some connection to his victim. The arrest warrant was signed on a grey October morning, exactly 36 years and 1 month after Chloe Sander had disappeared. Margaret Sander, now a widow whose husband had died without ever learning the truth, sat in her kitchen and wept. Not tears of relief or closure, but the deep, racking sobs of a mother whose worst fears had finally been confirmed. The questions that had haunted her family and community for nearly 4 decades had been answered, but the answers brought no peace, only the bitter knowledge that evil had walked among them wearing the mask of a helpful county employee, and that Chloe's trust and kindness had been weaponized against her by someone who had taken advantage of everything good about small-town life. For those who have followed this journey into one of Nebraska's most haunting cold cases, the story of Chloe Sander reminds us that sometimes the truth we seek comes at a price that makes us question whether we really wanted to know it all along. If cases like this one resonate with you, if you believe that every victim deserves to have their story told and their memory honored, please subscribe and share your thoughts about how communities can protect their most vulnerable members, while still maintaining the trust and openness that makes small-town life worth preserving.